I can see the farm yet with perfect clearness. I can see all its belongings, all its details. The family room of the house, with a trundle bed in one corner and a spinning wheel in another. A wheel whose rising and falling wail, heard from a distance, was the mournfulest of all sounds to me, and made me homesick and low-spirited, and filled my atmosphere with the wandering spirits of the dead. The vast fireplace, piled high, on winter nights, with flaming hickory logs from whose ends a sugary sap bubbled out but did not go to waste, for we scraped it off and ate it. The lazy cat spread out on the rough hearthstones, the drowsy dogs braced against the jambs and blinking, my aunt in one chimney corner knitting, my uncle in the other smoking his corncob pipe, the slick and carpetless oak floor faintly mirroring the dancing flame tongues and freckled with black indentations where fire coals had popped out and died a leisurely death. Half a dozen children romping in the background twilight. Split, bottom chairs here and there, some with rockers. A cradle, out of service, but waiting, with confidence. In the early cold mornings, a snuggle of children, in shirts and chemises, occupying the hearthstone and procrastinating. They could not bear to leave that comfortable place and go out on the wind-swept floor space between the house and kitchen where the general tin basin stood, and wash. Along outside of the front fence ran the country road, dusty in the summertime and a good place for snakes. They liked to lie in it and sun themselves. When they were rattlesnakes or puff adders, we killed them. When they were black snakes or racers or belonged to the fabled hoop breed, we fled without shame. When they were house snakes or garters, we carried them home and put them in Aunt Patsy's work basket for a surprise, for she was prejudiced against snakes, and always when she took the basket in her lap and they began to climb out of it, it disordered her mind. She never could seem to get used to them. Her opportunities went for nothing. And she was always cold toward bats, too, and could not bear them. And yet I think a bat is as friendly a bird as there is. My mother was Aunt Patsy's sister, and had the same wild superstitions. A bat is beautifully soft and silky. I do not know any creature that is pleasanter to the touch, or is more grateful for caressings, if offered in the right spirit. I know all about these coleoptera, because our great cave, 3 miles below Hannibal, was multitudinously stocked with them, and often I brought them home to amuse my mother with. It was easy to manage if it was a school day, because then I had ostensibly been to school and hadn't any bats. She was not a suspicious person, but full of trust and confidence, and when I said, "There's something in my coat pocket for you," she would put her hand in. But she always took it out again herself. I didn't have to tell her. It was remarkable, the way she couldn't learn to like private bats. I think she was never in the cave in her life, but everybody else went there. Many excursion parties came from considerable distances up and down the river to visit the cave. It was miles in extent and was a tangled wilderness of narrow and lofty clefts and passages. It was an easy place to get lost in. Anybody could do it, including the bats. I got lost in it myself, along with a lady, and our last candle burned down to almost nothing before we glimpsed the search party's lights winding about in the distance. Injun Joe, the half-breed, got lost in there once and would have starved to death if the bats had run short. But there was no chance of that. There were myriads of them. He told me all his story. In the book called Tom Sawyer, I starved him entirely to death in the cave, but that was in the interest of art. It never happened. General Gaines, who was our first town drunkard before Jimmy Finn got the place, was lost in there for the space of a week, and finally pushed his handkerchief out of a hole in a hilltop near Saverton, several miles down the river from the cave's mouth, and somebody saw it and dug him out. There is nothing the matter with his statistics except the handkerchief. I knew him for years and he hadn't any. But it could have been his nose. That would attract attention. Beyond the road where the snakes sunned themselves was a dense young thicket, and through it a dim-lighted path led a quarter of a mile. Then out of the dimness one emerged abruptly upon a level great prairie, which was covered with wild strawberry plants, vividly starred with prairie pinks and walled in on all sides by forests. The strawberries were fragrant and fine, and in the season we were generally there in the crisp freshness of the early morning, while the dew beads still sparkled upon the grass, and the woods were ringing with the first songs of the birds. Down the forest slopes to the left were the swings. They were made of bark stripped from hickory saplings. When they became dry, they were dangerous. They usually broke when a child was 40 feet in the air, and this was why so many bones had to be mended every year. I had no ill luck myself, but none of my cousins escaped. There were 8 of them, and at one time and another they broke 14 arms among them. But it cost next to nothing, for the doctor worked by the year, $25 for the whole family. I remember 2 of the Florida doctors, Chowning and Meredith. They not only tended an entire family for $25 a year, but furnished the medicines themselves. good measure, too. Only the largest persons could hold a whole dose. Castor was the principal beverage. The dose was half a dipperful, with half a dipperful of New Orleans molasses added to help it down and make it taste good, which it never did. The next standby was calomel, the next, rhubarb, and the next, jalap. Then they bled the patient and put mustard plasters on him. It was a dreadful system, and yet the death rate was not heavy. The calomel was nearly sure to salivate the patient and cost him some of his teeth. There were no dentists. When teeth became touched with decay or were otherwise ailing, the doctor knew of but one thing to do. He fetched his tongs and dragged them out. If the jaw remained, it was not his fault. Doctors were not called in cases of ordinary illness. The family's grandmother attended to those. Every old woman was a doctor, and gathered her own medicines in the woods, and knew how to compound doses that would stir the vitals of a cast-iron dog. And then there was the Indian doctor, a grave savage, remnant of his tribe, deeply read in the mysteries of nature and the secret properties of herbs, and most backwoodsmen had high faith in his powers and could tell of wonderful cures achieved by him. In Mauritius, away off yonder in the solitudes of the Indian Ocean, there is a person who answers to our Indian doctor of the old times. He is a Negro and has had no teaching as a doctor, yet there is one disease which he is master of and can cure, and the doctors can't. They send for him when they have a case. It is a child's disease of a strange and deadly sort, and the Negro cures it with a herb medicine which he makes himself from a prescription which has come down to him from his father and grandfather. He will not let anyone see it. He keeps the secret of its components to himself, and it is feared that he will die without divulging it. Then there will be consternation in Mauritius. I was told these things by the people there in 1896. We had the faith doctor, too, in those early days, a woman. Her specialty was toothache. She was a farmer's old wife and lived 5 miles from Hannibal. She would lay her hand on the patient's jaw and say, "Believe," and the cure was prompt. Mrs. Utterback, I remember her very well. Twice I rode out there behind my mother, horseback, and saw the cure performed. My mother was the patient. Dr. Meredith removed to Hannibal by and by, and was our family physician there, and saved my life several times. Still, he was a good man and meant well. Let it go. I was always told that I was a sickly and precarious and tiresome and uncertain child, and lived mainly on allopathic medicines during the first 7 years of my life. I asked my mother about this, in her old age. She was in her 88th year, and said, "I suppose that during all that time you were uneasy about me." "Yes, the whole time. Afraid I wouldn't live." After a reflective pause, ostensibly to think out the facts, "No, afraid you would." It sounds like a plagiarism, but it probably wasn't. The country schoolhouse was 3 miles from my uncle's farm. It stood in a clearing in the woods and would hold about 25 boys and girls. We attended the school with more or less regularity once or twice a week. In summer, walking to it in the cool of the morning by the forest paths, and back in the gloaming at the end of the day. All the pupils brought their dinners in baskets, corn dodger, buttermilk, and other good things, and sat in the shade of the trees at noon and ate them. It is the part of my education which I look back upon with the most satisfaction. My first visit to the school was when I was 7. A strapping girl of 15 in the customary sunbonnet and calico dress asked me if I used tobacco, meaning did I chew it. I said no. It roused her scorn. She reported me to all the crowd and said, "Here is a boy 7 years old who can't chaw tobacco." By the looks and comments which this produced, I realized that I was a degraded object. I was cruelly ashamed of myself. I determined to reform, but I only made myself sick. I was not able to learn to chew tobacco. I learned to smoke fairly well, but that did not conciliate anybody, and I remained a poor thing and characterless. I longed to be respected, but I never was able to rise. Children have but little charity for each other's defects. As I have said, I spent some part of every year at the farm until I was 12 or 13 years old. The life which I led there with my cousins was full of charm, and so is the memory of it yet. I can call back the solemn twilight and mystery of the deep woods, the earthy smells, the faint odors of the wild flowers, the sheen of rain-washed foliage, the rattling clatter of drops when the wind shook the trees, the far-off hammering of woodpeckers and the muffled drumming of wood pheasants in the remoteness of the forest, the snapshot, glimpses of disturbed wild creatures scurrying through the grass. I can call it all back and make it as real as it ever was and as blessed. I can call back the prairie, and its loneliness and peace, and a vast hawk hanging motionless in the sky, with his wings spread wide and the blue of the vault showing through the fringe of their end feathers. I can see the woods in their autumn dress, the oaks purple, the hickories washed with gold, the maples and the sumacs luminous with crimson fires, and I can hear the rustle made by the fallen leaves as we plowed through them. I can see the blue clusters of wild grapes hanging amongst the foliage of the saplings, and I remember the taste of them and the smell. I know how the wild blackberries looked and how they tasted, and the same with the pawpaws, the hazelnuts, and the persimmons, and I can feel the thumping rain upon my head of hickory nuts and walnuts when we were out in the frosty dawn to scramble for them with the pigs, and the gusts of wind loosed them and sent them down. I know the stain of blackberries and how pretty it is, and I know the stain of walnut hulls and how little it minds soap and water, also what grudged experience it had of either of them. I know the taste of maple sap and when to gather it, and how to arrange the troughs in the delivery tubes, and how to boil down the juice, and how to hook the sugar after it is made. Also, how much better hooked sugar tastes than any that is honestly come by. Let bigots say what they will. I know how a prize watermelon looks when it is sunning its fat rotundity among pumpkin vines and cymblins. I know how to tell when it is ripe without plugging it. I know how inviting it looks when it is cooling itself in a tub of water under the bed, waiting. I know how it looks when it lies on the table in the sheltered grate, floor space between house and kitchen, and the children gathered for the sacrifice and their mouths watering. I know the crackling sound it makes when the carving knife enters its end, and I can see the split fly along in front of the blade as the knife cleaves its way to the other end. I can see its halves fall apart and display the rich red meat and the black seeds, and the heart standing up, a luxury fit for the elect. I know how a boy looks behind a yard-long slice of that melon, and I know how he feels, for I have been there. I know the taste of the watermelon which has been honestly come by, and I know the taste of the watermelon which has been acquired by art. Both taste good, but the experienced know which tastes best. I know the look of green apples and peaches and pears on the trees, and I know how entertaining they are when they are inside of a person. I know how ripe ones look when they are piled in pyramids under the trees, and how pretty they are and how vivid their colors. I know how a frozen apple looks in a barrel-down cellar in the wintertime, and how hard it is to bite, and how the frost makes the teeth ache, and yet how good it is notwithstanding. I know the disposition of elderly people to select the specked apples for the children, and I once knew ways to beat the game. I know the look of an apple that is roasting and sizzling on a hearth on a winter's evening, and I know the comfort that comes of eating it hot, along with some sugar and a drench of cream. I know the delicate art and mystery of so cracking hickory nuts and walnuts on a flat iron with a hammer that the kernels will be delivered whole. And I know how the nuts, taken in conjunction with winter apples, cider and donuts, make old people's tales and old jokes sound fresh and crisp and enchanting, and juggle an evening away before you know what went with the time. I know the look of Uncle Dan's kitchen as it was on privileged nights when I was a child, and I can see the white and black children grouped on the hearth, with the firelight playing on their faces and the shadows flickering upon the walls, clear back toward the cavernous gloom of the rear, and I can hear Uncle Dan telling the immortal tales which Uncle Remus Harris was to gather into his books and charm the world with, by and by, and I can feel again the creepy joy which quivered through me when the time for the ghost story of the golden arm was reached, and the sense of regret, too, which came over me, for it was always the last story of the evening, and there was nothing between it and the unwelcome bed. I can remember the bare wooden stairway in my uncle's house, and the turn to the left above the landing, and the rafters and the slanting roof over my bed, and the squares of moonlight on the floor, and the white cold world of snow outside, seen through the curtainless window. I can remember the howling of the wind and the quaking of the house on stormy nights, and how snug and cozy one felt, under the blankets, listening, and how the powdery snow used to sift in, around the sashes, and lie in little ridges on the floor, and make the place look chilly in the morning, and curb the wild desire to get up, in case there was any. I can remember how very dark that room was, in the dark of the moon, and how packed it was with ghostly stillness when one woke up by accident away in the night, and forgotten sins came flocking out of the secret chambers of the memory and wanted a hearing, and how ill-chosen the time seemed for this kind of business, and how dismal was the hoo-hooing of the owl and the wailing of the wolf, sent morning by on the night wind. I remember the raging of the rain on that roof, summer nights, and how pleasant it was to lie and listen to it, and enjoy the white splendor of the lightning and the majestic booming and crashing of the thunder. It was a very satisfactory room, and there was a lightning rod which was reachable from the window, an adorable and skittish thing to climb up and down, summer nights, when there were duties on hand of a sort to make privacy desirable. I remember the coon and possum hunts, nights with the Negroes, and the long marches through the black gloom of the woods, and the excitement which fired everybody when the distant bay of an experienced dog announced that the game was treed. Then the wild scramblings and stumblings through briars and bushes and over roots to get to the spot. Then the lighting of a fire and the felling of the tree, the joyful frenzy of the dogs and the Negroes, and the weird picture it all made in the red glare. I remember it all well, and the delight that everyone got out of it, except the coon. I remember the pigeon seasons when the birds would come in millions and cover the trees, and by their weight break down the branches. They were clubbed to death with sticks. Guns were not necessary and were not used. I remember the squirrel hunts and the prairie chicken hunts and the wild turkey hunts and all that, and how we turned out mornings while it was still dark to go on these expeditions, and how chilly and dismal it was, and how often I regretted that I was well enough to go. A toot on a tin horn brought twice as many dogs as were needed, and in their happiness they raced and scampered about, and knocked small people down, and made no end of unnecessary noise. At the word, they vanished away toward the woods, and we drifted silently after them in the melancholy gloom. But presently the gray dawn stole over the world, the birds piped up, then the sun rose and poured light and comfort all around. Everything was fresh and dewy and fragrant, and life was a boon again. After 3 hours of tramping, we arrived back wholesomely tired, overladen with game, very hungry, and just in time for breakfast. Mark Twain. To be continued. Footnote. North American Review. Number DCXI. March 15, 1907. Chapters from My Autobiography, Roman 14. By Mark Twain. Dictated Thursday, December 6, 1906. From Sussie's Biography of Me. Feb. 27 Sunday. Clara's reputation as a baby was always a fine one, mine exactly the contrary. One often related story concerning her braveness as a baby, and her own opinion of this quality of hers is this. Clara and I often got slivers in our hands, and when Mamma took them out with a much-dreaded needle, Clara was always very brave, and I very cowardly. One day Clara got one of these slivers in her hand, a very bad one, and while Mamma was taking it out, Clara stood perfectly still without even wincing. I saw how brave she was and turning to Mamma said, "Mamma, isn't she a brave little thing?" Presently Mamma had to give the little hand quite a dig with the needle, and noticing how perfectly quiet Clara was about it, she exclaimed, "Why, Clara, you are a brave little thing." Clara responded, "Nobody's braver but God." Clara's pious remark is the main detail, and Sussy has accurately remembered its phrasing. The 3-year-older's wound was of a formidable sort, and not one which the mother's surgery would have been equal to. The flesh of the finger had been burst by a cruel accident. It was the doctor that sewed it up, and to all appearances it was he, and the other independent witnesses, that did the main part of the suffering. Each stitch that he took made Clara wince slightly, but it shriveled the others. I take pride in Clara's remark, because it shows that, although she was only 3 years old, her fireside teachings were already making her a thinker and also an observer of proportions. I am not claiming any credit for this. I furnished to the children worldly knowledge and wisdom, but was not competent to go higher, and so I left their spiritual education in the hands of the mother. A result of this modesty of mine was made manifest to me in a very striking way, some years afterward, when Jean was 9 years old. We had recently arrived in Berlin at the time and had begun housekeeping in a furnished apartment. One morning at breakfast, a vast card arrived, an invitation. To be precise, it was a command from the Emperor of Germany to come to dinner. During several months I had encountered socially, on the continent, men bearing lofty titles, and all this while Jean was becoming more and more impressed, and awed and subdued by these imposing events, for she had not been abroad before and they were new. To her, wonders out of dreamland turned into realities. The imperial card was passed from hand to hand, around the table, and examined with interest. When it reached Jean, she exhibited excitement and emotion, but for a time was quite speechless. Then she said, "Why, Papa, if it keeps going on like this, pretty soon there won't be anybody left for you to get acquainted with but God." It was not complimentary to think I was not acquainted in that quarter, but she was young, and the young jumped to conclusions without reflection. Necessarily, I did myself the honor to obey the command of the Emperor Wilhelm Roman II. Prince Heinrich and 6 or 8 other guests were present. The Emperor did most of the talking, and he talked well and in faultless English. In both of these conspicuousnesses I was gratified to recognize a resemblance to myself, a very exact resemblance. No, almost exact, but not quite that, a modified exactness with the advantage in favor of the Emperor. My English, like his, is nearly faultless. Like him I talk well, and when I have guests at dinner I prefer to do all the talking myself. It is the best way and the pleasantest, also the most profitable for the others. I was greatly pleased to perceive that His Majesty was familiar with my books, and that his attitude toward them was not uncomplimentary. In the course of his talk, he said that my best and most valuable book was Old Times on the Mississippi. I will refer to that remark again, presently. An official who was well up in the Foreign Office at that time, and had served under Bismarck for 14 years, was still occupying his old place under Chancellor Caprovi. Smith, I will call him of whom I am speaking, though that is not his name. He was a special friend of mine, and I greatly enjoyed his society, although in order to have it, it was necessary for me to seek it as late as midnight and not earlier. This was because government officials of his rank had to work all day, after 9 in the morning, and then attend official banquets in the evening. Wherefore they were usually unable to get life-restoring fresh air and exercise for their jaded minds and bodies earlier than midnight. Then they turned out, in groups of 2 or 3, and gratefully and violently tramped the deserted streets until 2 in the morning. Smith had been in the government service, at home and abroad, for more than 30 years, and he was now 60 years old or close upon it. He could not remember a year in which he had had a vacation of more than a fortnight's length. He was weary all through to the bones and the marrow, now, and was yearning for a holiday of a whole 3 months, yearning so longingly and so poignantly that he had at last made up his mind to make a desperate cast for it and stand the consequences, whatever they might be. It was against all rules to ask for a vacation, quite against all etiquette. The shock of it would paralyze the chancellery. STEM etiquette and usage required another form. The applicant was not privileged to ask for a vacation, he must send in his resignation. The chancellor would know that the applicant was not really trying to resign and didn't want to resign, but was merely trying in this left-handed way to get a vacation. The night before the emperor's dinner, I helped Smith take his exercise, after midnight, and he was full of his project. He had sent in his resignation that day, and was trembling for the result. And naturally, because it might possibly be that the chancellor would be happy to fill his place with somebody else, in which case he could accept the resignation without comment and without offense. Smith was in a very anxious frame of mind, not that he feared that Caprovi was dissatisfied with him, for he had no such fear. It was the emperor that he was afraid of. He did not know how he stood with the emperor. He said that while apparently it was Caprovi who would decide his case, it was in reality the emperor who would perform that service, that the emperor kept personal watch upon everything, and that no official sparrow could fall to the ground without his privity and consent, that the resignation would be laid before his majesty, who would accept it or decline to accept it, according to his pleasure, and that then his pleasure in the matter would be communicated by Caprovi. Smith said he would know his fate the next evening, after the imperial dinner, that when I should escort his majesty into the large salon contiguous to the dining room, I would find there about 30 men, cabinet ministers, admirals, generals, and other great officials of the empire, and that these men would be standing talking together in little separate groups of 2 or 3 persons, that the emperor would move from group to group and say a word to each, sometimes 2 words, sometimes 10 words, and that the length of his speech, whether brief or not so brief, would indicate the exact standing in the emperor's regard of the man accosted, and that by observing this thermometer an expert could tell, to half a degree, the state of the imperial weather in each case. That in Berlin, as in the imperial days of Rome, the emperor was the sun, and that his smile or his frown meant good fortune or disaster to the man upon whom it should fall. Smith suggested that I watch the thermometer while the emperor went his rounds of the groups, and added that if his majesty talked 4 minutes with any person there present, it meant high favor, and that the sun was in the zenith and cloudless for that man. I mentally recorded that 4-minute altitude, and resolved to see if any man there on that night stood in sufficient favor to achieve it. Very well. After the dinner, I watched the emperor while he passed from group to group, and privately I timed him with a watch. 2 or 3 times he came near to reaching the 4-minute altitude, but always he fell short a little. The last man he came to was Smith. He put his hand on Smith's shoulder and began to talk to him, and when he finished, the thermometer had scored 7 minutes. The company then moved toward the smoking room, where cigars, beer, and anecdotes would be in brisk service until midnight, and as Smith passed me, he whispered, "That settles it. The chancellor will ask me how much of a vacation I want, and I shan't be afraid to raise the limit. I shall call for 6 months." 1891, 1899. Smith's dream had been to spend his 3 months' vacation, in case he got a vacation instead of the other thing, in one of the great capitals of the continent, a capital whose name I shall suppress at present. The next day, the chancellor asked him how much of a vacation he wanted and where he desired to spend it. Smith told him. His prayer was granted, and rather more than granted. The chancellor augmented his salary and attached him to the German embassy of that selected capital, giving him a place of high dignity bearing an imposing title, and with nothing to do except attend banquets of an extraordinary character at the embassy, once or twice a year. The term of his vacation was not specified. He was to continue it until requested to come back to his work in the Foreign Office. This was in 1891. 8 years later, Smith was passing through Vienna, and he called upon me. There had been no interruption of his vacation, as yet, and there was no likelihood that an interruption of it would occur while he should still be among the living. Dictated Monday, December 17, 1906. As I have already remarked, Old Times on the Mississippi got the Kaiser's best praise. It was after midnight when I reached home. I was usually out until toward midnight, and the pleasure of being out late was poisoned every night by the dread of what I must meet at my front door. An indignant face, a resentful face, the face of the portier. The portier was a tow-headed young German, 22 or 3 years old, and it had been for some time apparent to me that he did not enjoy being hammered out of his sleep nights to let me in. He never had a kind word for me, nor a pleasant look. I couldn't understand it, since it was his business to be on watch and let the occupants of the several flats in at any and all hours of the night. I could not see why he so distinctly failed to get reconciled to it. The fact is, I was ignorantly violating, every night, a custom in which he was commercially interested. I did not suspect this. No one had told me of the custom, and if I had been left to guess it, it would have taken me a very long time to make a success of it. It was a custom which was so well established and so universally recognized that it had all the force and dignity of law. By authority of this custom, whosoever entered a Berlin house after 10 at night must pay a trifling toll to the portier for breaking his sleep to let him in. This tax was either 2.5 cents or 5 cents, I don't remember which, but I had never paid it and didn't know I owed it. And as I had been residing in Berlin several weeks, I was so far in arrears that my presence in the German capital was getting to be a serious disaster to that young fellow. I arrived from the imperial dinner sorrowful and anxious, made my presence known, and prepared myself to wait in patience the tedious minute or two, which the portier usually allowed himself to keep me tarrying, as a punishment. But this time there was no stage wait. The door was instantly unlocked, unbolted, unchained, and flung wide, and in it appeared the strange and welcome apparition of the portier's round face, all sunshine and smiles and welcome, in place of the black frowns and hostility that I was expecting. Plainly, he had not come out of his bed. He had been waiting for me, watching for me. He began to pour out upon me in the most enthusiastic and energetic way a generous stream of German welcome and homage, meanwhile dragging me excitedly to his small bedroom beside the front door. There, he made me bend down over a row of German translations of my books and said, "There, you wrote them, I have found it out. By God, I did not know it before, and I ask a million pardons. That one there, The Old Times on the Mississippi, is the best book you ever wrote." The usual number of those curious accidents which we call coincidences have fallen to my share in this life. But for picturesqueness, this one puts all the others in the shade. That a crowned head and a portier, the very top of an empire and the very bottom of it, should pass the very same criticism and deliver the very same verdict upon a book of mine, and almost in the same hour and the same breath, is a coincidence which out-coincidences any coincidence which I could have imagined with such powers of imagination as I have been favored with, and I have not been accustomed to regard them as being small or of an inferior quality. It is always a satisfaction to me to remember that whereas I do not know, for sure, what any other nation thinks of any one of my 23 volumes, I do at least know for a certainty what one nation of 50 millions thinks of one of them, at any rate. For if the mutual verdict of the top of an empire and the bottom of it does not establish for good and all the judgment of the entire nation concerning that book, then the axiom that we can get a sure estimate of a thing by arriving at a general average of all the opinions involved is a fallacy. Dictated Monday, February 10, 1907. 2 months ago, December 6, I was dictating a brief account of a private dinner in Berlin, where the Emperor of Germany was host and I the chief guest. Something happened day before yesterday which moves me to take up that matter again. At the dinner, His Majesty chatted briskly and entertainingly along in easy and flowing English, and now and then he interrupted himself to address a remark to me or to some other individual of the guests. When the reply had been delivered, he resumed his talk. I noticed that the table etiquette tallied with that which was the law of my house at home when we had guests. That is to say, the guests answered when the host favored them with a remark, and then quieted down and behaved themselves until they got another chance. If I had been in the emperor's chair and he in mine, I should have felt infinitely comfortable and at home, and should have done a world of talking and done it well. But I was guest now, and consequently I felt less at home. From old experience, I was familiar with the rules of the game, and familiar with their exercise from the high place of host. But I was not familiar with the trammeled and less satisfactory position of guest. Therefore, I felt a little strange and out of place. But there was no animosity. No, the emperor was host. Therefore, according to my own rule, he had a right to do the talking. And it was my honorable duty to intrude no interruptions or other improvements, except upon invitation. And of course, it could be my turn someday. Someday, on some friendly visit of inspection to America, it might be my pleasure and distinction to have him as guest at my table. Then I would give him a rest and a remarkably quiet time. In one way, there was a difference between his table and mine. For instance, atmosphere. The guests stood in awe of him, and naturally they conferred that feeling upon me, for after all, I am only human, although I regret it. When a guest answered a question, he did it with deferential voice and manner. He did not put any emotion into it, and he did not spin it out, but got it out of his system as quickly as he could, and then looked relieved. The emperor was used to this atmosphere, and it did not chill his blood. Maybe it was an inspiration to him, for he was alert, brilliant, and full of animation. Also, he was most gracefully and felicitously complimentary to my books, and I will remark here that the happy phrasing of a compliment is one of the rarest of human gifts, and the happy delivery of it another. In that other chapter, I mentioned the high compliment which he paid to the book, Old Times on the Mississippi. But there were others, among them some gratifying praise of my description in A Tramp Abroad of certain striking phases of German student life. I mention these things here because I shall have occasion to hark back to them presently. Dictated Tuesday, February 12, 1907. Those stars indicate the long chapter which I dictated yesterday, a chapter which is much too long for magazine purposes, and therefore must wait until this autobiography shall appear in book form, 5 years hence, when I am dead. 5 years according to my calculation, 27 years. According to the prediction furnished me a week ago by the latest and most confident of all the palmists who have ever read my future in my hand. The Emperor's Dinner, and its beer and anecdote appendix, covered 6 hours of diligent industry, and this accounts for the extraordinary length of that chapter. A couple of days ago, a gentleman called upon me with a message. He had just arrived from Berlin, where he had been acting for our government in a matter concerning tariff revision, he being a member of the commission appointed by our government to conduct our share of the affair. Upon the completion of the commission's labors, the emperor invited the members of it to an audience, and in the course of the conversation, he made a reference to me. Continuing, he spoke of my chapter on the German language in A Tramp Abroad, and characterized it by an adjective which is too complimentary for me to repeat here without bringing my modesty under suspicion. Then he paid some compliments to The Innocents Abroad, and followed these with the remark that my account, in one of my books of certain striking phases of German student life, was the best and truest that had ever been written. By this I perceive that he remembers that dinner of 16 years ago, for he said the same thing to me about the student chapter at that time. Next, he said he wished this gentleman to convey 2 messages to America from him and deliver them, one to the president, the other to me. The wording of the message to me was, "Convey to Mr. Clemens my kindest regards. Ask him if he remembers that dinner, and ask him why he didn't do any talking." Why, how could I talk when he was talking? He held the age, as the poker clergy say, and 2 can't talk at the same time with good effect. It reminds me of the man who was reproached by a friend who said, "I think it a shame that you have not spoken to your wife for 15 years. How do you explain it? How do you justify it?" That poor man said, "I didn't want to interrupt her. If the emperor had been at my table, he would not have suffered from my silence. He would only have suffered from the sorrows of his own solitude. If I were not too old to travel, I would go to Berlin and introduce the etiquette of my own table, which tallies with the etiquette observable at other royal tables. I would say, 'Invite me again, your majesty, and give me a chance.' Then I would courteously waive rank and do all the talking myself. I thank his majesty for his kind message, and am proud to have it and glad to express my sincere reciprocation of its sentiments." Dictated January 17, 1906. Rev. Joseph T. Harris and I have been visiting General Sickles. Once, 20 or 25 years ago, just as Harris was coming out of his gate Sunday morning to walk to his church and preach, a telegram was put into his hand. He read it immediately, and then, in a manner, collapsed. It said, General Sickles died last night at midnight. He had been a chaplain under Sickles through the war. 1880. It wasn't so, but no matter, it was so to Harris at the time. He walked to the church, but his mind was far away. All his affection and homage and worship of his general had come to the fore. His heart was full of these emotions. He hardly knew where he was. In his pulpit, he stood up and began the service, but with a voice over which he had almost no command. The congregation had never seen him thus moved before in his pulpit. They sat there and gazed at him and wondered what was the matter. Because he was now reading, in this broken voice and with occasional tears trickling down his face, what to them seemed a quite unemotional chapter. That one about Moses begat Aaron, and Aaron begat Deuteronomy, and Deuteronomy begat St. Peter, and St. Peter begat Cain, and Cain begat Abel, and he was going along with this and half crying, his voice continually breaking. The congregation left the church that morning without being able to account for this most extraordinary thing, as it seemed to them. That a man who had been a soldier for more than 4 years, and who had preached in that pulpit so many times on really moving subjects, without even the quiver of a lip, should break all down over the begats, they couldn't understand. But there it is. Anyone can see how such a mystery as that would arouse the curiosity of those people to the boiling point. Harris has had many adventures. He has more adventures in a year than anybody else has in 5. One Saturday night, he noticed a bottle on his uncle's dressing bureau. He thought the label said hair restorer, and he took it in his room and gave his head a good drenching and sousing with it and carried it back and thought no more about it. Next morning when he got up his head was a bright green. He sent around everywhere and couldn't get a substitute preacher, so he had to go to his church himself and preach, and he did it. He hadn't a sermon in his barrel, as it happened, of any lightsome character, so he had to preach a very grave one, a very serious one, and it made the matter worse. The gravity of the sermon did not harmonize with the gaiety of his head, and the people sat all through it with handkerchiefs stuffed in their mouths to try to keep down their joy. And Harris told me that he was sure he never had seen his congregation, the whole body of his congregation, the entire body of his congregation, absorbed in interest in his sermon, from beginning to end before. Always there had been an aspect of indifference, here and there, or wandering somewhere, but this time there was nothing of the kind. Those people sat there as if they thought, good for this day and train only. We must have all there is of this show, not waste any of it. And he said that when he came down out of the pulpit, more people waited to shake him by the hand and tell him what a good sermon it was than ever before. And it seemed a pity that these people should do these fictions in such a place, right in the church, when it was quite plain they were not interested in the sermon at all. They only wanted to get a near view of his head. Well, Harris said no, Harris didn't say, I say, that as the days went on and Sunday followed Sunday, the interest in Harris's hair grew and grew. Because it didn't stay merely and monotonously green, it took on deeper and deeper shades of green. And then it would change and become reddish and would go from that to some other color, purplish, yellowish, bluish, and so on, but it was never a solid color. It was always mottled. And each Sunday it was a little more interesting than it was the Sunday before. And Harris's head became famous. And people came from New York and Boston and South Carolina and Japan and so on to look. There wasn't seating capacity for all the people that came while his head was undergoing these various and fascinating modelings. And it was a good thing in several ways, because the business had been languishing a little, and now a lot of people joined the church so that they could have the show, and it was the beginning of a prosperity for that church which has never diminished in all these years. Mark Twain. To be continued. North American Review. Number de Caesar. APRA 1907. Chapters from My Autobiography, Roman 15. By Mark Twain. Dictated October 8, 1906. From Sussie's Biography of Me. Papa says that if the cholera comes here, he will take sour mash to the mountains. 1885. This remark about the cat is followed by various entries, covering a month, in which Jean, General Grant, the sculptor Gerhardt, Mrs. Candace Wheeler, Miss Dora Wheeler, Mr. Frank Stockton, Mrs. Mary Mapps Dodge, and the widow of General Custer appear and drift in procession across the page, then vanish forever from the biography. Then Sussie drops this remark in the wake of the vanished procession. Sour mash is a constant source of anxiety, care, and pleasure to Papa. I did, in truth, think a great deal of that old tortoiseshell harlot, but I haven't a doubt that in order to impress Sussy, I was pretending agonies of solicitude which I didn't honestly feel. Sour Mash never gave me any real anxiety. She was always able to take care of herself, and she was ostentatiously vain of the fact. Vain of it to a degree which often made me ashamed of her, much as I esteemed her. Many persons would like to have the society of cats during the summer vacation in the country, but they deny themselves this pleasure, because they think they must either take the cats along when they return to the city, where they would be a trouble and an encumbrance, or leave them in the country, houseless and homeless. These people have no ingenuity, no invention, no wisdom, or it would occur to them to do as I do: rent cats by the month for the summer and return them to their good homes at the end of it. Early last May, I rented a kitten of a farmer's wife by the month. Then I got a discount by taking three. They have been good company for about 5 months now, and are still kittens. At least they have not grown much, and to all intents and purposes are still kittens, and as full of romping energy and enthusiasm as they were in the beginning. This is remarkable. I am an expert in cats, but I have not seen a kitten keep its kittenhood nearly so long before. These are beautiful creatures, these triplets. Two of them wear the blackest and shiniest and thickest of sealskin vestments all over their bodies, except the lower half of their faces and the terminations of their paws. The black masks reach down below the eyes, therefore when the eyes are closed they are not visible. The rest of the face, and the gloves and stockings, are snow white. These markings are just the same on both cats, so exactly the same that, when you call one, the other is likely to answer, because they cannot tell each other apart. Since the cats are precisely alike and can't be told apart by any of us, they do not need two names, so they have but one between them. We call both of them sackcloth, and we call the gray one ashes. I believe I have never seen such intelligent cats as these before. They are full of the nicest discriminations. When I read German aloud they weep. You can see the tears run down. It shows what pathos there is in the German tongue. I had not noticed before that all German is pathetic, no matter what the subject is nor how it is treated. It was these humble observers that brought the knowledge to me. I have tried all kinds of German on these cats: romance, poetry, philosophy, theology, market reports, and the result has always been the same. The cats sob and let the tears run down, which shows that all German is pathetic. French is not a familiar tongue to me, and the pronunciation is difficult and comes out of me encumbered with a Missouri accent. But the cats like it, and when I make impassioned speeches in that language, they sit in a row and put up their paws, palm to palm, and frantically give thanks. Hardly any cats are affected by music, but these are. When I sing, they go reverently away, showing how deeply they feel it. Sour Mash never cared for these things. She had many noble qualities, but at bottom she was not refined and cared little or nothing for theology and the arts. It is a pity to say it, but these cats are not above the grade of human beings, for I know by certain signs that they are not sincere in their exhibitions of emotion, but exhibit them merely to show off and attract attention. Conduct which is distinctly human, yet with a difference: they do not know enough to conceal their desire to show off, but the grown human being does. What is ambition? It is only the desire to be conspicuous. The desire for fame is only the desire to be continuously conspicuous and attract attention and be talked about. These cats are like human beings in another way. When Ashes began to work his fictitious emotions and show off, the other members of the firm followed suit in order to be in the fashion. That is the way with human beings. They are afraid to be outside. Whatever the fashion happens to be, they conform to it, whether it be a pleasant fashion or the reverse, they lacking the courage to ignore it and go their own way. All human beings would like to dress in loose and comfortable and highly colored and showy garments, and they had their desire until a century ago, when a king, or some other influential ass, introduced somber hues and discomfort and ugly designs into masculine clothing. The meek public surrendered to the outrage, and by consequence we are in that odious captivity today, and are likely to remain in it for a long time to come. Fortunately, the women were not included in the disaster, and so their graces and their beauty still have the enhancing help of delicate fabrics and varied and beautiful colors. Their clothing makes a great opera audience an enchanting spectacle, a delight to the eye and the spirit, a Garden of Eden for charm and color. The men, clothed in dismal black, are scattered here and there and everywhere over the garden, like so many charred stumps, and they damage the effect but cannot annihilate it. In summer we poor creatures have a respite, and may clothe ourselves in white garments, loose, soft, and in some degree shapely. But in the winter, the somber winter, the depressing winter, the cheerless winter, when white clothes and bright colors are especially needed to brighten our spirits and lift them up, We all conform to the prevailing insanity and go about in dreary black, each man doing it because the others do it, and not because he wants to. They are really no sincerer than sackcloth and ashes. At bottom, the sackcloths do not care to exhibit their emotions when I am performing before them. They only do it because ashes started it.